In this news roundup of the week for the 29th of March 2024, the tide of the war is turning against Ukraine, even as Russia is confronted with a new crisis from ISIS terrorism. China continues to push its neighbours in the South China Sea. Could it be the Philippines rather than Taiwan that becomes the next flashpoint? A would-be eco-terrorist is jailed for 13 years in Britain. You probably didn't even hear about him, but he could just be the first. And what does the US federal government and the major automakers have in common? Probably an unhealthy interest in your data, and not necessarily to your benefit. While Russia has been coming to terms with the horrible terrorist attack in Moscow last week, mostly doing so, of course, by blaming it on Ukraine because there's no event so awful it can't be hijacked to support the current message, Ukraine is clearly running into real problems. The general tenor of current commentary is that it's facing its most dangerous period since the first month of the Russian invasion. This comes from the critical shortage it has in artillery ammunition and other military equipment, a shortage which is now really starting to bite on the front line. Russia is now firing artillery shells at a rate 5 times higher than Ukraine, depleting Ukraine's stockpiles. Reportedly, Ukraine is rationing its artillery units to fire only 2,000 rounds per day across a 750-mile front, while Russia is firing 10,000 daily. This ammunition shortage not only reduces Ukraine's abilities to repel Russian attacks, but also makes Ukrainian artillery more vulnerable to Russian counter-battery fire and drone strikes. When Putin settled in and decided to play the long game, this was the sort of turning point he was looking forward to. Now, NATO attempted to address the issue by signing back in January a €1.1 billion deal to buy 220,000 rounds of the most widely used artillery shells, which sounds great, except for the small detail that won't arrive for 2 to 3 years. Particularly needed right now is missile defences to continue to defend cities and other key targets from Russian attacks. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba emphasised, shall we say, the sense of urgency when he said this week, "Give us the damn Patriots," referring to the US Patriot surface-to-air missile system. If we had enough air defence systems, namely Patriots, we would be able to protect not only the lives of our people, but also our economy from destruction. Kuleba also said that Ukrainian troops were now starting to lose their positions because Russia has begun using upgraded aerial guided bombs at scale. It's not as though Russia's own ammunition production isn't facing challenges and obstacles, but it will still be able to outlast Ukraine unless Western support that has been promised actually becomes reality. But what about that attack in Moscow? Well, in a startling concession to the fact that reality is still a thing, President Putin did, somewhat belatedly for sure, acknowledge that the attack was carried out by Islamic militants. Now, that still didn't stop him from trying to find some way to pin the blame on Ukraine, with a suggestion, totally absent of any evidence of course, that they had been expected to escape over the Ukrainian border and had willing collaborators waiting there to help them. Basically, he implied that somehow Kiev was in the position of ordering Islamic terrorists to carry out its bidding, which would be news to everyone, not least ISIS-K, who claimed responsibility for the attack. And Putin said this, "The question that arises is who benefits from this? This atrocity may just be a link in a whole series of attempts by those who have been at war with our country since 2014 by the hands of the neo-Nazi Kiev regime." Weirdly, Putin failed to acknowledge that this was exactly the sort of attack that the US administration had warned him about, both privately and then publicly. Instead, he suggested that Russia's relationship with Hamas and its stance on the war in Gaza meant that Russia would not be an ISIS target. This ignores that ISIS has long had Russia in its sights for propping up the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The terrorists were Tajik nationals, and another 9 people have been arrested in Tajikistan in connection with the attack. Central Asian migrants make up a significant proportion of Russia's migrant labour population. Some of them have been seeing the post-attack backlash from Russians who are not overly on message that this was really Ukraine's fault. Reportedly, there's been a sharp increase in beatings, in vandalism and other expressions of racism, such as Tajik citizens being evicted without reason. The embassy of Tajikistan warned its citizens not to leave their homes in Russia in the aftermath of the attack unless absolutely necessary. Putin's deflection onto Ukraine could well be the opportunity, of course, that he has been waiting for, to ratchet up military action with the populist rallying cry that it's striking back against those responsible for a traumatic attack. Meanwhile, China continues to push the boundaries to establish what it sees as its emerging role as an assertive global power. While you may be aware what that means in relation to Taiwan, it has also been acting the bully in the South China Sea towards its other neighbours there generally. In particular, China's claim to waters that overlap with what would be considered other countries' exclusive economic zones. In recent months, China has been repeatedly interfering with the Philippines' resupply missions to a small garrison on the second Thomas Shoal, a strategically important feature. The Philippines has deliberately grounded a ship there to reinforce its territorial claim. China has used its Coast Guard vessels and fishing boats to block and even collide with Philippine ships. China claims the Second Thomas Shoal as its own territory, although an international tribunal, The Hague's Permanent Court of Arbitration, ruled in 2016 that China's expansive claims in the South China Sea have no legal basis. Well, of course, China disagrees. It all rather depends if you think we still live in a rules-based world or a might makes right world. The tensions have been going up because the current Philippine president, Marcos Jr., has taken a stronger stance against China's actions compared to his predecessor, and this week he announced plans to implement new, unspecified countermeasures against what he described as illegal, coercive, aggressive, and dangerous attacks. And he wrote on Facebook, because that's how diplomacy and foreign affairs works these days apparently, "We seek no conflict with any nation, more so nations that purport and claim to be our friends, but we will not be cowed into silence, submission or subservience." We know that America could get drawn into a conflict with Taiwan, but what about in this case? Well, the US has reaffirmed that its mutual defence pact with the Philippines extends to the South China Sea and has warned that an attack on Philippine forces would trigger a US response. The Philippines has been conducting joint patrols with the United States and with other allies in the region. For the US, the disputes are seen as a matter of national interest because of the importance of the waterways there for global trade and commerce, which may be why, although it has been pushing the line, so far China has not crossed the line. Specifically, China has so far refrained from using its military forces, likely due to concerns about potential escalation and US intervention. That said, they are clearly not intending to back down from their claims to territory across the South China Sea, so this potential flashpoint not going to go away anytime soon. Now, those of you who have followed this channel for a while will know that I've said on a number of occasions that I rather expect that some of the eco-apocalyptic movements would eventually spawn small subgroups that would cross over into the use of violence or terrorism tactics. The vast majority of people who take part in such movements, of course, would never contemplate going anywhere near such a thing. They are just protesting over what they see to be a huge problem that affects their future. But if you persuade people that the world is literally going to end as the result of actions by the elites, that is a message that will give some people permission to take things to a dark place, because what have you got to lose? I was reminded of that recently as a young man called Jacob Graham was jailed for 13 years. Now, you probably haven't heard of him, which is a good thing, because it means he didn't get to put his plans into operation. Graham was the administrator for a Telegram channel called Total Earth Liberation Group with 150 members. He was on several other such groups, Earth Militia and Neo-Luddite Action. He said he supported the Green Party, he was anti-corporations because they damage the Earth. Well, he was jailed last week for preparing acts of terrorism. He'd compiled and shared a bomb-making manual, as you do, and declared that he wanted to kill at least 50 people. The security services were tipped off to his activities when they were investigating the purchase of chemicals online. When they raided his home, they found some of those chemicals. They found video that he'd shot of his bomb-making experiments in the back garden. On his bedroom wall, he had a picture of a car bomb exploding with the words, "Make politicians afraid to start their cars again." During his trial, the court heard that he had come to idolize the American terrorist, the Unabomber. This had led him to draw up his plan, which stated he was planning a bombing campaign which would end in a glorious shooting spree. Now, this is not the sort of organised group that I was predicting, obviously. Random individuals with a rage against the world, light onto all sorts of issues, and the ecocide wasn't the only one of a melange of grievances that Jacob had been storing up. Nevertheless, it's not incompatible with the view that this is how it starts to show itself. One anarchist website reflected on the situation like this: "Wanton destruction of the planet in the name of profit and the cost of living crises that seem to be compounding every day for the working class are on everybody's lips. And yet it would appear that nothing is to be done about it. And those who do take action are villainized. Taking action note by planning to bomb those held to be guilty. But that reasoning takes not a dent on the world perception that creates this sort of narrative." The good news is that in its early stages, any move towards individuals collaborating on this sort of project, maybe some of those individuals on that Telegram group, for instance, they will be spotted early by the security services, who are pretty good at sniffing this sort of thing out, and the individuals who are first exploring how they could take things into this sort of realm generally make a lot of mistakes that makes the job easy for them. The bad news is that they do get better, and sooner or later they begin to organise in ways that are harder to intercept. Random loners cooking up randomly violent plans in the bedroom of their mother's house with no strategy and no collaborators, they're only the indicator that there's a set of factors here that represent the kindling for the fire to come. Let's hope it's the worst that we ever get, because with the general perception of pushback against climate policies there is right now, I think the moment is ripe for some misguided people to decide that taking stupid actions will further their cause. And finally, a couple of separate cases have really highlighted just how much your digital privacy is being hijacked by those who don't necessarily have your interests at heart. Forbes reported last week that the US federal government obtained court orders forcing Google to provide the personal data of people who have viewed specific YouTube videos. These orders, which were only recently unsealed, give a stark picture of law enforcement tactics that use relatively routine investigations to turn into a large-scale trawl of users' activities that they probably would have believed was private. This came about because of a probe into an individual who was suspected of money laundering. As part of the investigation, undercover agents sent the suspect links to a public YouTube tutorial on drone mapping, and then they required YouTube to disclose the identities of all the people who had viewed that video during that period. Names, addresses, telephone numbers, user activity. Privacy campaigners described the requests as unconstitutional and terrifying overreach, since they infringe the privacy of potentially thousands of people in pursuit of just one. It's not the only time similar requests have been made. For example, authorities in New Hampshire pulled something similar when they decided that they wanted to get details on everyone who had watched live streams on YouTube around the time that some anonymous bomb threats had been phoned in. And there was no evidence whatsoever in that case that the perpetrator of those threats had been watching these live streams, just the supposition that they might have been. Now, it's not only the government where you need to be concerned. Earlier this month, the New York Times revealed that automakers have been collecting data from all the fancy gadgetry in cars these days about how customers drive. That information was being sold to insurance companies, who were then pushing up insurance premiums if they saw behaviour in the data that led them to conclude that you were a higher risk. This, of course, was totally above board because the customers had all consented to their data being used. I mean, that's presuming that they'd read the full detail of the 100+ pages of the end-user agreement. But, everyone does that, don't they? Good news this week, though. General Motors, having been sued for doing exactly this, came back with a promise that they wouldn't do it again. In an email statement, they said, OnStar Smart Driver customer data is no longer being shared with LexisNexis or Verisk. Customer trust is a priority for us, and we are actively evaluating our privacy processes and policies. Yeah, customer trust is a priority for us, ever since we got caught completely abusing it anyway. It's a choice you make, whether you decide to believe the promises of companies that say such things under those circumstances. Like most people, I tend to go by what people do rather than what they merely say. But then, your mileage may differ. Alright, my thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. I could not produce these videos without that support. If you would like to add yours, please head on over to patreon.com/MallenBaker. It is always appreciated. If you are watching this in a timely fashion, I hope you have a great Easter this coming weekend. If you're watching it in a non-timely fashion, well, I hope you have a good week, whatever you're doing.